And thanks for the opportunity. It's nice to see people, even if only virtually. Um, uh, as was just noted, I am on partial leave. I'm being sort of rented by the CDC for a year and possibly more, for 3/4 of my time to be um, the director for science at the new Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics at the CDC. Um, I should emphasize that everything I'm describing now, almost all of it predates my time at the CDC, and all of it is my opinion as an academic and as a personal opinion, not anything that reflects the opinions of the CDC or the U.S. government. Um, that allows me to be more more uh, um, candid, and so I want to talk really about science communication in the COVID era, and mostly about the first year of the COVID pandemic, because that was the period where many of us really put enormous effort into science communication. Um, and I'll talk a little bit more about the recent times toward the end, but this is mostly a look back to the first year of the pandemic. So, and I'm happy, it's hard for me to see if some people have questions, but I'm happy to respond to questions or comments in the midst of the talk. So feel free to raise your hand or just to break in and ask a question, because it's hard to see both the screen on Zoom and the slides. So I'm going to talk about kind of the basics of science communication, which, as I've come to see them over the last little while, but not in exactly the classic order of who, what, when, where, why, and how. I'm going to start with why. And in a word, the reason why authoritative scientific sources need to be speaking about the pandemic and about science is because there are a lot of agendas out there, and not all of them are to present the facts. And whatever your political views about the policy decisions that are right or wrong or wise or unwise, I think there should be widespread agreement that having good facts is the basis for having a meaningful conversation about the decisions. And we may disagree a lot on the decisions, but we should at least agree on our best understanding of the facts. This is a screenshot from the Georgia Department of Public Health website in May of 2020, which appears to show a declining trend in the number of COVID cases in the most affected counties in Georgia. These are all four of them are in the major counties in the Atlanta area, and Hall County is Gainesville, Georgia, north of Atlanta. And the Georgia Department of Public Health put this on their website, and I got an email from a journalist asking me what I thought of this chart. And I was reading it on my phone, so I couldn't really read the x-axis. And I had to ask them what they wanted me to focus on, because it just looked like a graph of numbers. I didn't really know what they were asking. But if you look a little bit more carefully, you can see that the x-axis is arranged not in chronological order, but in order of declining numbers. So the first is 28th of April, then 27th of April, then 29th of April, then 1st of May, then 30th of April, and so forth. So what the Georgia Department of Public Health had done was, in order to justify a more lenient control strategy, they had provided data that were, in some sense, accurate, but were presented in a way that only someone who really, really knew what they were doing could decode was deceptive. There was not a declining trend. There was an up and down trend. You can also see that the counties are rearranged each day to go from highest to lowest. So this is just deeply deceptive. And while that is not the rule, and most public health agencies have been doing their best most of the time to present data well, if even an official agency is doing this I think is the kind of thing that meant that we as scientists needed to be that needed to be active in communication. I don't know how to stop that. I'm sorry. Sorry, I'm teaching. I have to call you back. And it was not just states. Of course, the federal government was also very actively controlling the message. And academics and scientists outside of government have a lot of privilege. We have academic freedom and tenure in many cases, and certainly a forum to speak that is unhindered by our bosses telling us what we can and can't say. So thus, I think we have a great responsibility to step in situations where the information coming is not good. Coming from official sources is not good. And that's not only to try to convince governments to do a better job, but also to try to convince or to help individuals make decisions. And the vacuum of information made it hard for individuals to make informed decisions, even beyond those of the government. It was also an opportunity to educate the public about our field. Until 3 years ago, the average person on the street didn't know what R0 was. And now the average person on the street has at least heard about it an awful lot of times. Whether they can define it or not, you can, thanks to this course, if you couldn't before. But certainly the whole field has exploded onto the scene, and it's helpful for people to understand it. And because it's a complicated field, there's a risk of misinterpretation, and that can cause undue alarm or on the other hand, inadequate responses. So this was an op-ed that I wrote very early on, describing what these numbers that estimate severity, the case fatality rate and other related quantities, actually mean. And I think it's important to point out that part of why it was hard for the public to understand things is that experts also find these topics difficult. So what's shown here is a paper that I wrote with a bunch of colleagues, mostly at the Imperial College in London, where I was doing a sabbatical during the Ebola outbreak. And that was about sort of complexities in trying to figure out the severity of a new infection, in that case Ebola. And the fact that you can write an academic paper about it means that it's not just that experts all get it and need to explain to the misunderstanding public, but even that among people who spend their careers working on these things, the concepts are complicated. So it's not that members of the public can't understand, it's that they're difficult. Some of them are difficult concepts, even for anyone to understand. So I've always thought of working with the media as kind of a partnership. Reporters in many ways are like scientists, but they work much faster and their training is much broader but less focused. And so when one of the first things that we did during the pandemic, Bill Hanage in CCDD and I, was to write this blog post in Scientific American on principles for reporters to help them understand how to report the very, very fast-changing news. And we suggested that there are kind of three levels of information. One is what we know is true, the second is what we think is true, and the third is opinions and speculation and hypotheses. And our suggestion was that reporters should try their best to distinguish with new information which of those three things it was, so that they could report it accurately. But also, it's interesting to think about the scientific process as kind of the process of trying to turn things from C to B to A. So we start by speculating, and we try by observation, experiment, calculation, and other techniques to get a better understanding that pushes us towards B, what we think is true, and if we do it well enough and extensively enough, maybe to the point of A. So journalists get a bombardment from all these stages of the scientific process, which are overlapping in a pandemic. And so the difficulty of distinguishing it is one of the big challenges. There was some really bad policy suggestions made by very smart, very well-intentioned people during the pandemic based on bad science. Some of which bad science was partly from the Harvard School of Public Health, I should say. This is an example. This is some of the real big names in public health, very bright and well-meaning people, who suggested that we should try to emulate what Wuhan, China was doing and force people to quarantine outside their homes, even involuntarily, in order to stop household transmission of COVID. This recommendation was based on a study that was published in a major journal by a number of colleagues, including at least one at our school, which, because it used the wrong formula or misinterpreted the formula for estimating transmission of transmission rates, took the data from Wuhan, which is shown up here, and estimated that only when they instituted the most draconian measures were they able to bring transmission below the critical threshold of an R of 1. But in fact, because the things were moving so quickly, a proper application of that formula actually estimated that happened in a less draconian moment, at a time when they were not forcing people to do that. So you can have lots of objections to forcing people into quarantine, many of which are not directly about public health, but even the argument in favor of it was based on bad science, and so thus the need for better communication. So that's a lot about the why. What about the who? One of the odd things was that with a new virus in a family that was not very widely studied, there were some coronavirologists, but not very many. There was really almost nobody who was a true expert on this virus. There was nobody who was a true expert on this virus because it had never been seen before. There were people who had adjacent expertise in some of these fields, and those people learned as quickly as they could what they needed to learn about SARS-CoV-2. But that also is challenging for the science communicator. A little bit of knowledge can be a dangerous thing. One of the people who spent a lot of time being very alarmist, especially at the beginning, often correct, but often not correct about the meaning of scientific work, was this person who had been affiliated with our school as well, loosely, and was putting out a mix of sensible stuff and very alarmist stuff on social media. He continues to do that, and he trumpets his epidemiological qualifications, which are in the epidemiology of nutrition. Expertise is important, but a little bit of expertise is not necessarily enough. Although other people with similarly adjacent knowledge have been much more responsible and helpful in the science communication. So I think this kind of raises a hard question that I don't have an answer for, which is how far beyond one's formal training is it reasonable to go in public communication? So I don't have an answer, but I think some considerations are that certainly every one of us is entitled to hold and express views about every topic. I am not a baseball player. I don't actually care that much about baseball, but I am entitled to my views about baseball, and I'm entitled to express them in whatever forum I want. That's freedom of speech, and we have that. But when communicating in a forum where people respect your statements because they know you're knowledgeable, then there's a level of responsibility that's not about what you're allowed to say, but what you should say. And in my view, some hallmarks of that are to try to flag what is fact, what's educated opinion, and what's personal belief. And the more one is venturing away from what one actually knows about, the more cautious one should be. And then last, everybody gets things wrong. Even the greatest experts find out the facts incorrectly, or they interpret them wrong, or they forget something in the interpretation, or whatever. And one of the interesting things during the pandemic, and one of the ways that I've sort of used to try to tell how much I trust someone, is how quickly they correct, and how anxious they are to find out if they've been wrong and to set the record straight. And some people, the most reliable people, are very anxious to be corrected, because that way they learn, and they are no longer responsible for getting it wrong. And some people really are tenacious about their positions, even when they're shown to be wrong. One of the funny discussions that happened in 2020 was, I said on Twitter that that people should admit when they don't know the answer to something. And the arguably most respected science reporter in this field said, anybody who says this is out of my area of expertise is someone I will trust above someone who will answer about anything. No one knows anything and shouldn't pretend to. And then Ed Yong, who's probably the other most respected journalist in this area, made a joke out of it. I'm not sure really quite what he thought we were, how someone would make some money doing this, but it sounds like a nice joke. You don't have to be old and gray to do good science communication. And in fact, one of the things that I have really tried to emphasize in meetings of people trying to make decisions and discuss this topic is the importance of having different voices from different generations, because I think people just do have different experience. It's another axis of diversity, but one of the least diverse axes for many Zoom rooms that I've been in is age. It's not the only axis, but it's one. So Kevin, who you have met, and James, who's a postdoctoral fellow at CCDD, were among the people who were doing science communication very actively, and Tiggy as well. The three of them were doing science communication very effectively and very vocally. So what form could it take? It could take the form of explainers. So I wrote up, for example, an explainer first on Twitter, and then as a blog post about the seasonality and the idea that COVID might just go away in the warmer weather, saying that wasn't going to happen, but explaining why. It can take the form of providing policy advice. So this was an op-ed arguing for the benefit of keeping parks open when some of them were being closed to try to stop COVID. This is to remind me about the work that Jonathan Grad and his group have done advising the NBA about how to keep the season going by extensive testing and bubbles. And this is a piece by Michael Mina, our former colleague, who emphasized the value of widely available testing, which is finally becoming a reality, more of a reality, but rather late in the game. There's also the possibility of doing good science communication to help individuals make better decisions. So this was a very early effort in March of 2020 with Scott Gottlieb to try to suggest some small steps that individuals could take. This was one with Joe Allen about reducing transmission. Sometimes the main goal is to provide a sense of urgency. At times when there were debates about whether we should really take measures to control the coronavirus, like in March of 2020, Some people were arguing we need to learn more before we should take action, and I made the opposite argument. And this has been a theme that a number of us in CCDD have returned to. Another form of communication is to clear up misunderstandings. So this was a figure from a paper that we wrote very early on in the pandemic that showed that probably Indonesia, given how many travelers go into Indonesia from Wuhan, and that travel volume, that it's very unlikely that the 0 cases that had been detected in Indonesia of COVID-19 by mid-February or so were really 0, but rather it was more likely that they were missing some cases. That led to comments from the health minister in Indonesia that Harvard was meddling and was sort of disrespecting Indonesia. And so an Indonesian student at HSPH took the opportunity to do a video that she put on social media that asked me to, where she interviewed me and asked me to explain what the purpose of this analysis was and clarify that it was not to disrespect Indonesia, but to provide a warning, etc. So sometimes you have to do some damage control as well. More abstractly, it's sometimes helpful when scientists are so much in the news to try to help explain how scientists think, and that was the goal of this article. So then what about where? Talking to reporters is one thing, publishing specific pieces, being on Twitter and YouTube and other media are all approaches. Also, importantly, speaking in communities. Kizzmekia Corbett, who's now one of our faculty members at Harvard School of Public Health, at the time was at NIH and was, while she was doing research on the mRNA vaccines, she was also very actively working, especially in Black churches, but also elsewhere, to spread good information about the value of vaccines. Dr. Fauci tried to do the same. You can use reports and websites and other sort of institutional ways of making outreach. I got involved in some legal proceedings where the county of Santa Clara in California was being sued for restricting religious events such as 1,700 person church services indoors with no masks and singing. We were unsuccessful in defending the restrictions, and the Supreme Court ultimately ruled that those restrictions were too much, but this is a way to get involved. Emma Accorsi, who was a doctoral student at the time and is now an EIS officer at CDC, got involved with a group in Oregon on occupational health for migrant workers. And I got a little bit involved. She really led this, and this is not uncommon that students become the conduit to getting involved. So we provided some scientific evidence about the value of better occupational health standards for protecting migrant workers, farm workers from transmission. Sometimes the communication is really better or is merely directed at our fellow scientists. And for reasons of time, I won't go through the details of these, but publishing in scientific journals, but with sort of social and societal messages in mind is another way of communicating, but it has a different, narrower, but sometimes more influential audience. So then I think one of the interesting questions is how to do it. I think sticking to the facts and admitting uncertainty is always important. Emphasizing the uncertainties wherever they are. So I found that to be important when I had been very vocal in recommending that St. Patrick's Day parades be canceled in March of 2020. And there had been a narrative that the parades in 1918 in Philadelphia and elsewhere were the main spark that set off the 1918 flu pandemic. Many people believe that. The evidence for that is very limited. It's suggestive, but probably the pandemic was going and that was at most an amplifying event. So rather than using the fact that many people thought that 1918 flu had been set off by these parades, I was pretty explicit that that it was not necessarily causal, but it was still a good idea to reduce parades and other public gatherings as we were trying to step up public health measures. Fast forward to the summer, and the gatherings were not for St. Patrick's Day, but were for Black Lives Matter, and many people were saying to public health experts, "You said we had to cancel St. Patrick's Day because it would start more transmission. How come you're now changing your tune?" And I was glad at that point that I could honestly say, no, I said we should reduce optional gatherings while we're learning what's happening. And no, I don't think it's going to start the pandemic, but I do think it's a wise thing to do. And this is a different setting, and people were masking and people were outdoors. So I was glad that I had not overplayed the hand in the spring. And then one thing that really gets forgotten more than it's remembered these days, especially on social media, is civility. And that should not be a way of shutting down debate, but it's so much easier sometimes to say that someone's an idiot or doesn't know what they're talking about or has no qualifications than to argue with their facts or their description of the facts. But it's much more useful to have a debate on the merits, because sometimes the people you disagree with are right. Sometimes they are real jerks who deserve to be flamed, but often they are people who are trying to get it right. And the debate does not get better as it becomes more personal. So to summarize, the pandemic has really been an unusual opportunity for scientists, and especially epidemiologists and modelers, to communicate with the public. In the first year, the weak communication by the federal government made it especially important, and that's why we at CCDD really made a deliberate plan to do it very actively. There are a lot of media, and there are a lot of forums and a lot of roles, including for people in all generations, not just people who have been at it for 3 decades or whatever. It's important to have those voices, but it's also important to have voices of the people who are just coming through the educational system and have a different perspective. And then for all of us, we need to maintain a level of humility, of admitting our ignorance, correcting our mistakes, and trying to seek the facts rather than fame. Just a brief 3 things that I've learned from my half year or so in government. One is that I'm surprised how much people in power pay attention to the Twitterverse. That was not something I understood until starting. The second is that people on Twitter and other commentators often see a part of the issue, but not all of it. And what I think people often forget is that decisions about public health are made almost always out of a mixture of economic, political, feasibility, and other considerations along with public health considerations, and they should be. And finally, it's just really hard for public health agencies to be both very quick and responsive and also to avoid getting it wrong, especially when the facts are changing daily. So when people criticize the slowness of information coming from the government, they are right to want more, but it's also I don't think there is a system by which you get very high quality information very quickly. There's a trade-off. So I will stop there. I'm sorry I took much of the time, but I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Very relevant. Yeah, so feel free to go ahead and ask Dr. Lipsitch any questions you have. You can unmute yourself, ask them in the chat.
Okay, so you kind of touched on this, and you kind of talked about when you make mistakes and correcting them. But what are some different ways that to correct your mistakes and to notice them as well?
Well, the good and bad thing about social media is that you get corrections quickly. People will correct you, and so if it's really a matter of just getting the facts wrong, which everyone does sometimes, you can just delete the tweet or delete the message or put up a new one saying this is wrong and this is why. If it's on some other media where you don't have access to it again, then it's harder. But again, I mean, there is a lot of scrutiny. So if someone else corrects it and you have an opportunity to respond, that's another way to do it. And I think those are the two most important things. And then also to remember that no single sort of utterance on social media or whatever is the end of the story. There is you're going to be back. You'll be talking about the same topic again. So at a minimum, you can make sure to get it right the next time.
Thank you.
Any other questions? You can also put them in the chat and I'll read them aloud for you.
I would say one of the really encouraging and things that's made me proud about CCDD has been the fact that really the students have taken at least as active a role as the faculty in doing communication during the pandemic, and the ones that are on here and the postdocs as well. The ones who are on here are among the most active, but it's really been a very big team effort, and that's been really fun to do.
Thanks. Okay, so there's a question in the chat from Maria. Can you explain what bad science is?
Well, I guess it's science that's not good, right? So there is an ideal of good science, which is carefully checked and done with the proper methods and done in a way that finds the errors before it becomes public as much as possible, and done in a way that is aware of the societal context when that's relevant. Sometimes it's not. Not all science has a much societal context, but much of it does. And so less good science is science that misses some of that. And I think people, sometimes there's a view that peer review is what distinguishes good science from bad science. So once it passes peer review, it's good. And I've been trying to push for a view where we think of peer review as the fourth and perhaps least reliable part of a four-part safety net. So I think the way you get good science is first to train scientists well, so that they know what they're doing. Secondly, to develop in scientists a sense of a desire to find all the ways they could be wrong before someone else does. And maybe that doesn't sound like what scientists normally do, but often when you find something new in science or really surprising and fascinating, it's that new because it's actually not right. And so we all have various practices that we use and which we could do better to try to find why it might be wrong before we submit it for publication and before, etc. So that's the second. And sorry, I think peer review is the third. So the comments of reviewers who evaluate what you've done. And then the fourth is replication, where other people try to use what you've done and see if it's correct and follow the consequences. And if it's not, that's still another check. So I think of all of those as sort of four pillars or four parts of the safety net, whatever metaphor you want to use. But I think peer review is sometimes seen as the only part that's important, and I just think it's more complex than that. What about TikTok?
Yeah, so do you see that as becoming as influential as the Twitterverse? I don't know. That's a great question.
It's a great question. And, I think that's an example of why you don't want only 50-year-olds, 52-year-olds doing science communication, because I probably will never do a TikTok, although my daughters might help me to do one. But yes, I think, it's going to play some role for whatever reason, partly because the people in legislatures and the executive branch and public health agencies, if they're on Twitter, on social media, they tend to be on Twitter because they tend to be my age or a little younger or a little older. And not that many people who use TikTok yet have bachelor's degrees, but that's changing. And soon they'll have PhDs and master's degrees and whatever. So yeah, Gloria says it will be critical. So yeah, Gloria, do you want to comment?
I worry about TikTok a little bit just because it's like, I guess sorry, I have there's a doggy fight club happening right behind me, so I hope you can't hear it. Just because, it's, I feel like our age gaps are definitely shrinking as we move along in terms of just like digital technology and innovations and stuff. I know that, people who have Facebook are like old, people who are on Twitter are just like, also kind of old. So, and LinkedIn's just like a weird, like social network that only very specific groups utilize. So, TikTok is it's a very, very efficient mode of communication, and the fact that it's sort of a more ADHD friendly version of Twitter, because you have like these short kind of snippets where you have to summarize your message really fast. Otherwise, it's just a matter of a swipe and you go on to the next topic. And so I do kind of worry how, people like in government, or the average age is about 65, how we're going to really be able to speak to, Gen Z and then whatever happens after that. But, these are just my concerns. Maybe in another life I could have been an influencer, but, life goes on. I don't know if that wasn't very insightful, but I'm just expressing concerns here. Thanks.
In the interest of correcting the record and admitting a mistake, I should say I was reading my slides. I, like many people, have a little bit of amnesia from even the beginning of the pandemic. And I was reading my slides and described the people who I could see on the tweet, which was Kevin and James Hay, about the statement on protests and systemic racism. But as Kevin pointed out in the chat, actually Tiggy was the one who initiated that. And I apologize, Tiggy, for that. It was too much amnesia. Shouldn't have to read your own slides. You should know what's on them, but I didn't. So.
All right. Well, thank you so much. That was wonderful.